down, and as they're coming down, I just want to say that watching these films consecutively, this is actually the kind of longest and most, I think, complicated in some ways curation that we've done of this material from the book, and I'm just struck and impressed again by the range of approaches that these filmmakers with really different motivations and different methods bring to this material. And it's, I think, particularly interesting to do a program like this in the city in which so many of these films were actually made. And there's this very interesting way in which they preserve records of the communities in which these films were made. And so I'm sure those of you who are native Angelinos or spent a lot of time here recognize some of the places in the films that you saw tonight. So one of the things that has struck me about meeting the filmmakers who make these films, in particular those that I've interviewed who have come out of USC and UCLA, is how politically engaged and how kind of conscious they were about the importance of thinking about the communities that were maybe being underserved or underrepresented around them. And many of the filmmakers that I've interviewed, like for example, those who made Felicia were very active in like CORE and the Congress on Racial Equality, et cetera. And so it's really an honor and a privilege to have Jeremy and John with us tonight to talk about the films that they made. And I thought I would just start by asking them to tell us a little bit about how they came to their subjects. Obviously, you were both students at the time you made these films, and then we can open it up to any questions that you have in the audience. So I don't know who wants to start, but John, did you want to? So John directed Cotton Eye Joe.
When I started at USC, I was told in the first semester that we had to do 6 Super 8 millimeter films within the semester, and they'd be one every 2 weeks. And I started doing those films, and at one point I was hiking through the hills up in Elysian Park, and I came across Joe's encampment, and I met him finally. I kept going back until I found him there. I thought he was kind of hiding from me every time I went up there because I sensed that he didn't want to have anybody to talk to him. And I just realized that this would make a really good subject for a film when I got the skills to do so. So I actually made the film you saw tonight 2 years later, just kind of kept it in the back of my mind. And documentaries weren't really a thing that people were doing at USC. So I didn't think I would make a documentary as my senior project, but it ended up, kind of working out that way.
Thank you. And Jeremy, if you could talk. So Jeremy's was
Sure.
the last film that we saw, Sense of Community.
Well, first of all, I've never imagined 45 years later that there would be a crowd to see this film. So it's a lot of fun to be here tonight. And I expected 6 people, so I was pleasantly surprised. So I had read an article about piecework and people who work at home, and I was fascinated by that subject because it really was below the radar, and particularly women, Hispanic women, being taken advantage of for labor. And so I went to the Women's Garment Union and said, can you give me some leads, because I want to do this film on homework, which was just, basically slavery labor. And they said, we'll give you all those leads, but we also have a subject which might be interesting to you. And they told me about this church where they were making garments for Pennies and Sears, and locked in all day long. And I just was fascinated by that subject, and spoke Spanish, so I was able to talk to the employees during the weekend in the park, and they were terrified, but we kept looking around, and they gave me a lot of information, and that's where the narration for the employees came from. So that's how I found the subject. And at the end, I just want to jump to, I gave the Garment Union the film after I completed it, and I think that was the end of the church.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Are there questions from the audience? Yes, in the back. Oh, we do have a microphone running up there. And let me also say, while the microphone is running up there, for those of you, I know that there are some PhD students in the audience tonight. I think one of the greatest things about doing this research is, getting to reach out to filmmakers. I don't know if you both recall when I first contacted you, the reaction is usually like, what? You're interested in what? From when? From when I was a student? I mean, and once you get over the shock of being contacted for something you did so long ago, I mean, it's really interesting to get to have these conversations. And in the case of, talking with John about his other films, we learned about these other projects that were related to this that are now have been given to USC or are in the process of being given to USC. I don't remember exactly the circumstances, but working with Dino Everett on that. And so it's a way that you can kind of perpetuate a legacy of caring for these films and retaining some kind of a record of them by going through this process. The internet has made all of this very easy to do, by the way. So yes, question.
Yes. One thing, after seeing all these films consecutively, my constant question was, what happened to all these people?
Yeah.
Later on, did their dreams become a reality or whatnot, with Felicia or the girl who wanted to dance, or especially the transgender man? I can't imagine at that time. It was incredible how proud and comfortable he was for that time period. So I'm just curious, between the three of you, I don't know how much information you have on that. Thanks.
Do you know?
I don't know about any of the other films and what happened.
No, I meant with Joe. Just with
Oh,
Joe.
with Joe.
Yeah.
Well, Joe. Well, the film did win a lot of film festivals. I went all over the world with it. It was great. When I was in Germany, I actually met my wife, who I'm still married to, and she said, "Don't say I'm here tonight. Our daughter's here." Anyway, and so
Joe was arrested during the making, right? But
yeah, he was there. Yeah.
Do you know what happened to Joe?
Well, he died in the mid '70s. I came back and started working, trying to get work because film school is like living in this different kind of fantasy world where you do whatever you want and you're not worried about making a living. And so I got a call from a social worker a couple of years later after the film was done, and she said, "Do you know Joe Wagner?" I said, "Yes." She goes, "He's in the county hospital dying of cancer." So I went and lugged a 16 millimeter projector down there and showed him the film in his hospital room with all the doctors and nurses there. He had pancreatic cancer, and the film finished, and he said, "You mean we spent all that time filming and it's only 12 minutes long?"
That's great. So I can speak to Felicia in particular. So I do try when I'm doing research on films like this to also find the subjects. And it's interesting. I found an address for Felicia, and I wrote her a letter. And 18 months later, I got an email back, and she had moved a couple of times, and the letter chased her around. And she actually went to UC Santa Barbara. She was one part of like the first cohort of color at UC Santa Barbara, and she recalled. I interviewed her with Allie. We met with her in Los Angeles, where she still lives, and so she got a degree in history from Santa Barbara, and she talked with us about what it was like being one of the few women of color at UCSB. Not easy, but they got through it. And she went on to do some work in politics and community organizing. And when we met with her, which was probably now 5 or 6 years ago, she had just moved not far from where she used to live, where she grew up, and she was working in community organizing again. So it was quite extraordinary to interview her. And when we showed her the film, she did not remember having ever seen it. And she, we asked the filmmakers about it, and they said, "Really? We felt like we showed it to her." I don't know. I mean, a lot of time has elapsed between 1965 and when we interviewed everyone, but we showed the film to her, and it was a home movie to her. This was her family. This was her life. And it was very emotionally moving and difficult and wonderful all at the same time for her to watch this, because it was so much her story. And I will just say one thing that she mentioned as she was watching it. She started laughing at one point, and we kept pausing it, and she said, "Oh my gosh, my mom made us wear our Sunday clothes for that getting ready for school scene where they're eating the cereal at the table. We had to wear like the Sunday church clothes. Like we would never have gone to school like that." So are there other questions? Yes.
What drew me to this program was the fact that an Iranian filmmaker was making
Yeah.
a film on the East Side. I'd love to have more information on him, and if you can speak to this nexus, which I think is really interesting, because he makes the film, or it's released in 1974. This is a kind of nascent time for the Iranian American community, and there are a lot of echoes and resonances in this program. We see liminal space, how important it is in your film and in Mr. Rezvani's film, and it resonates a lot with me to see a film that is in a way attempting to, there's a boosterist dynamic in that Japanese American film, which in some sense is trying to grapple with our collective history. And I would say that amnesia is firmly in the American grain. So this work that's being made outside of the mainstream is doing a number of things that are really interesting. And it seems to me, given what Iranians are dealing with at border points, really interesting to see how one film is dealing with the Japanese American community. Another film is being made by an Iranian filmmaker about the East Side. There's a lot to unpack there, but I suppose what I'm trying to do is throw things out there for conversation, but would be really interested to know more about Rezvani. I know he works in sound.
Yeah, and I wish I could answer that question better. That I regret that Allie is not here, because she actually wrote the section on that particular film, so she is much more expert about it than I. But I will say, I do think one of the things that a lot of these films share is precisely that idea of space. How do you carve out space, both literal space and then this kind of larger idea of cultural space and inheritance? And so many of these films are grappling with assimilation versus, kind of cultural heritage and holding on to that. And you can kind of weave through this, which we do this work partly in the introduction to the collection, to thinking about the way the films approach this in different ways. And I do think East Side Story is interesting because, all of these films have, they're on a kind of documentary spectrum, actually, even though that one I think is probably the most kind of fictional if you were to put these in a kind of lineup. But just in terms of thinking about the way that it imagines a sense of community dissolving and reforming, and how do you claim it? I mean, these are all really interesting, relevant questions on kind of both of those levels. And I like the way these films kind of speak to each other in that way, even though they're all about different communities and they approach the subject so distinctively, right? None of them kind of shares a methodology.
I mean, in 74, he's anticipating the battle for the East Side.
That's right. That's right. And it is quite extraordinary. I think a lot of these filmmakers, and again, I wish I could answer more specifically about that film and about him and the history of the making of that particular film. I know much more about some of the others we looked at. But what was I going to say? But the way that so many of the people who were making these films had their finger on the pulses of the change of the city. I mean, this is a very LA-centric program deliberately because we are doing it here. And, there's about, I would say, a dozen to 15 others that we've shown in different contexts. And they're really trying to understand and get in front of what's happening in these communities. There's a really wonderful film called The Savages that's about Venice that was made by one of the Felicia filmmakers that's looking at, kind of the other ghetto of the time besides Watts, which was Venice, and thinking about the way that community was changing and the way that there was an attempt to kind of have a black middle class in Venice that was being somewhat undermined by some of the kind of criminal activity in the community that was making it more of a kind of police state presence there. And so I think a lot of, especially again, the student filmmakers who were very active politically were thinking about the kind of consequences for gentrification and the way police were involved in communities and economic disparity in ways that are they're just absent in any other form of filmmaking. And it makes me remember that one of the things I didn't say in the introduction about Felicia is that film was actually shot in the spring of 1965, so it was before the August rebellions had happened that summer. And so this film was marketed as a film that captured this this moment prior to what would completely redefine Watts ever since, right? I mean, so it was really pitched as, if you want to understand what was happening in that community, here's somebody from within the community who was actually speaking it. Yes.
Yeah, this question is for both John and Jeremy. I'm very curious. I kind of liked Marsha's comment about sort of getting the phone call and what do you want to talk about. Since you made these films, how often or when, sort of in what situations, have you encountered these films? And like looking back on them, how do you see them sort of fitting in either a professional or your personally? How do you feel looking back on them?
Well, I haven't really seen this film for 40 years, so it's really surprising and it's fun to see it. But I think it really our family was involved in civil rights. My grandmother co-founded the ACLU, and I really was brought up really, I think, sensitive to different people, different races, different cultures. And when I made the film, I really was incensed, I think, by the fact that these people were really locked in, and it was just a sweatshop, and it was just all on the surface. I mean, it was easy to see, and he didn't hide anything. So, looking back on it, I'm really pleased to have done it. I think it was the right subject for me.
Yeah, for me, I actually have my film online at my website now, so anybody can go and see it. So I wanted to keep its life out there, so that because I think it's so much of it is relevant today as far as homelessness goes. I mean, he was the only guy on that hillside. He had that whole place to himself. Now, if I were to go back there, I'd bet there'd be homeless encampments all over the place. And so it was the story about this guy who kind of lives on the edge of society is something that actually continued through my career. And I'm actually working on a project now about a man who lives outside for 35 years, traveling with his 3 pack mules. He's 72 years old, and he just has chosen to live outside. And I followed him for 27 months, and we're editing the film right now. And then about 2009, I did a film called The Ghost Mountain Experiment, about a family who went and lived off the grid during the Depression and World War II down in the Anza-Borrego Desert So I seem to go back to these stories about people who live outside the norm of society. So I think it all started with Cotton Eye Joe. I guess I must have just, I don't look for those stories. I just kind of happen upon them. I mean, when they're there, I tend to gravitate towards them.
Oh, yes, in the back.
So I really appreciate the interest that you're going to do new subjects and try to bring others, subject matters to the attention of the society. So with that said, does the way how the society is viewing this kind of matters change your kind of creative style, or how you're gonna portray these films?
You're asking this of the filmmakers?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm not sure I understood the question. I'm sorry.
So, like, because the society is changing and how people are reading subjects are really changing with the political situation that's going on the backstage. So, does it kind of change how you would portray these subject matters now?
I don't know. I just, to me, this Joe is just the story of one individual who lives a different kind of lifestyle. And I guess now that I'm doing the story about the man who actually refers to himself as Mule, he wants to have the freedom to live his lifestyle too, without having laws and people who say that it doesn't fit into society and he doesn't follow our, the norm of the laws that have been established. And, yeah, that's what I find so interesting about it. So I think if I found Joe today, it might be a very similar film, because I just want to tell the story through this man's Mule's voice, have him tell the story in his own words, approach it almost like Joe in a way, where it's almost like almost like an experimental piece in a way, like Joe. You never really have any narration or even hear him talking, and so that's kind of how I would do that in today's landscape, I guess.
And I don't think I would show it differently. I mean, the point then and the point today would be kind of a point counterpoint, and I think that the same conditions continue. That illegal aliens below the radar are afraid to ask for their rights, or to go to help, to go to the union, and really so little has changed in many ways.
Well, I think if anything, it's gotten worse, right? So, and I think that speaks to the earlier comment about amnesia. That these films, I think at the time, the spirit of making some of them was like, okay, here's an issue, here's an inequity, here's something that we need to grapple with. And I would say the depressing part of watching these films is thinking about how little has changed, and when things have changed, often it's been for the worse. So
what I wanted to say too, it's interesting you talk about Joe going to jail for 2 months. Well, he just as we were beginning filming, we found out that he's gone to jail for 2 months. Chairman of the USC Cinema School went down to talk to the judge, and she goes, I can't release him. He's got a stack of crimes and all the crimes are like loitering,
right.
Those kinds of crimes. And he was a black man. And then I'd like to point out that Mule is a white man, but in some of the situations he's been caught in with the police, if he was a black man, he would probably be dead.
Well, I would like to thank both John and Jeremy for coming tonight. By the way, Jeremy came down from Santa Cruz, which I think is incredible. So thank them very much. And thank you all for coming tonight. And thank you, UCLA. And thank you, projectionists, for doing such a wonderful job.
Thanks for coming.